Inside the hangar in front of her entire engineering team, billionaire CEO Scarlett Hayes flicked a $50 bill at the feet of a broke mechanic named Logan Brooks and laughed out loud. "Start the jet my 12 experts couldn't," she said, "and I'll pay you $5 million. The team smirked. Logan simply picked up the bill, walked to the engine, and went to work. 5 minutes later, both turbines roared to life in dead silence. Scarlett honored the check, but no one in that hangar understood this was only the beginning. So who really won? The Brooks Aviation Repair Shop sat at the edge of a county airfield outside Amarillo, a metal building with an oil-stained floor and a coffee maker that had outlived 2 marriages Logan had watched other men go through. Logan Brooks had spent 12 years fixing military engines for the Air Force before he traded the uniform for this, a small operation where the invoices never quite covered the months. He was good with his hands and better with his ears, and everyone at the field knew it, which was a different thing entirely from being paid what that was worth. At 38, he carried the particular tiredness of a man who ran a household alone. There was no second income to catch a slow quarter, no partner to split the weight of a mortgage that had crept ahead of him. He kept the shop lights off when he could, and drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it, because every dollar he did not spend was a dollar that stayed where it belonged. He never talked about any of that. He just worked, and the work was honest. And most days, that was enough to keep him upright. 40 miles south in a glass tower that bore her family name. Scarlett Hayes ran an aerospace empire, the way she ran everything by deciding quickly and never looking back. She was 34 and had inherited a struggling company at 29, then dragged it into profit through sheer refusal to be underestimated. The industry was full of men who had smiled at her across boardrooms and assumed she would fold, and she had learned to read a person's worth the way she read a balance sheet, by the numbers attached to their name. It was a habit that had built her fortune, and it had never once occurred to her that it might cost her anything. The two of them had no reason to ever meet. Their worlds touched only through the parts catalogs and supply chains that fed the private aviation market, and Logan was so far down that chain he might as well have been invisible. Then, on a hot Tuesday in the middle of a summer that had cracked the tarmac, a courier order and a broken engine put them in the same hangar at the same hour, and nothing about either of their lives stayed the same afterward. Scarlett's private jet, a machine that had cost more than most men earned across a lifetime, had died on the ramp of the Hayes Aerospace Flight Center. She was due in Denver that afternoon to close an acquisition she had chased for a year, and the jet simply would not start. One turbine caught and quit. The other refused entirely. The soft, expensive silence where 2 engines should have been was the single sound in the building that no amount of money could argue with. Her people moved fast. Within the hour, 12 of the company's senior engineers had surrounded the aircraft with laptops and diagnostic rigs, running scans, pulling panels, talking over one another, in the confident shorthand of men accustomed to being the smartest in any room. Scarlett stood off to one side in a tailored charcoal suit and watched the minutes bleed away. Every so often, a lead engineer would approach her with a theory, and every theory ended the same way, with the engine still dead and the clock still moving. 2 hours in the confidence had curdled into something quieter. The engineers had chased the fault through the fuel system, the ignition, the control software, and the wiring, and each dead end had cost them a piece of their certainty. Marcus Reed, the flight center manager, kept assuring Scarlett that they were close, that it was only a matter of time. But the word close had started to sound like an apology. Scarlett said very little. She had built her reputation on results, and results were exactly what the room was failing to produce. It was into that failure that Logan walked entirely by accident. He had driven up from Amarillo to hand-deliver a hydraulic fitting that a smaller client leased through the Hayes supply desk, a routine drop that should have taken him 90 seconds and a signature. He came through the service door with the part in a paper sleeve and stopped because a man who has spent his life around engines does not ignore the sound of one failing to catch. He listened to the second turbine crank and die, and something in the rhythm of it snagged his attention like a wrong note in a song he knew by heart. He did not mean to speak. He had learned a long time ago that offering an opinion in a room full of people richer than you was a fast way to be embarrassed. But the sound came again, that same hitch on the same beat, and the answer arrived in his mind so plainly that staying silent felt like watching someone drown within arm's reach. "That's not your fuel system," he said to no one in particular and to everyone at once. "That's a starter air valve hanging up. You're chasing the wrong ghost." The nearest engineer turned first, then two more, and the ripple of attention traveled outward until the whole hangar was looking at a man in a work shirt holding a paper sleeve. Marcus Reed laughed short and dismissive, the laugh of a man protecting his territory. "Thanks, Chief," he said. "We've got actual engineers on it. You can leave the part at the desk." A few of the others smiled at the floor, and the message was unmistakable. Logan did not belong, and everyone in the room had already priced him accordingly. That was when Scarlett crossed the floor to see what had interrupted the work. She looked Logan over, once the worn boots, the calloused hands, the truck visible through the open bay door, and she arrived at a number the way she always did. To her, he was small, a delivery man who had wandered somewhere he was not wanted, and the arrogance of him offering a diagnosis in her hangar struck her as almost funny. She reached into her jacket, pulled out a $50 bill, and let it fall so that it drifted down and landed near his boot. "For your trouble," she said loud enough for the team to hear. "Now let the professionals work." The engineers laughed, relieved to have the intruder handled, and Marcus Reed laughed loudest of all. Logan looked at the bill on the concrete, but did not pick it up, and he did not move toward the door either, and that stillness was the first thing all day that made Scarlett genuinely curious rather than merely impatient. Something reckless rose in her, the same instinct that made her good at poker and dangerous in negotiations. She had a jet that would not start 12 experts who could not start it, and a stranger who claimed he could hear the problem from across the room. If he was a fool, she would enjoy watching him fail, and if he was not, she would learn something. Either way, the moment amused her, and amusement was rare enough in her life that she chased it. "Tell you what," she said, and now she was performing for the whole hangar. "My 12 experts have had 2 hours. I'll give you 5. Start both engines in 5 minutes, and I'll pay you $5 million. Real money wired today. Fail, and you take your $50 and you never come back here." She smiled the smile she used on men who were about to lose. "Do we have a deal?" The hangar went quiet in the particular way rooms do when someone has said something that cannot be taken back. The engineers stopped smirking because $5 million was not a joke, even to people who worked for Scarlett Hayes, and a bet made in front of witnesses was a bet that would have to be honored. Marcus Reed's face tightened. Logan finally bent, picked up the $50 bill, and folded it once into his shirt pocket, and only then did he answer, in a voice as level as a torque wrench setting. "Deal," he said. He walked to the aircraft without hurry, and the crowd parted for him, half of them expecting a show of failure, and the other half no longer sure. He set down his paper sleeve, crouched at the engine housing the second turbine, and laid his hand flat against the cowling the way another man might feel a horse's flank. He was not showing off. He was listening with his whole body the way 12 years of engines had taught him, and everything he needed was already in that sound. The starter air valve on this model was a known weakness, a component that could stick partly open and fool every sensor into blaming the fuel or the ignition, which was exactly the trap the senior engineers had spent 2 hours walking into. Logan pulled the access panel with a borrowed screwdriver, reached past the maze of lines the others had been probing, and found the valve seized at a hair off its seat. He worked it free, cleared the obstruction with 2 fingers and a rag, reseated it by feel, and closed the panel. The whole operation took less time than the argument that had preceded it. He stood, wiped his hands, and looked at the flight engineer nearest the controls. "Try it now," he said. The engineer glanced at Scarlett, who gave the smallest nod, and the man climbed up and hit the start sequence. The first turbine spun up and caught with a clean, rising howl. A breath later, the second turbine, the one that had refused 100 times that afternoon, caught with it, and the two engines settled into a smooth, synchronized roar that filled the hangar and made the diagnostic screens along the wall look suddenly foolish. Nobody spoke. 12 senior engineers stood in the wash of a sound they had been chasing for 2 hours and had not been able to produce, and a delivery man in a work shirt had produced it in under 5 minutes. Marcus Reed stared at the running engines as though they had personally betrayed him. The others looked at Logan, then at Scarlett, then away, doing the fast, private arithmetic of people recalculating who in the room actually knew what they were doing. Scarlett did not look away. She watched the engines, watched Logan wipe the last of the grease from his hands, and felt something she was not accustomed to feeling, which was that she had misjudged a number badly and in public. She was not a woman who broke her word, whatever else she was, and she had made this bet in front of 40 witnesses. She took her phone from her jacket, made one call to her finance office, and spoke 6 clipped sentences. "Wire $5 million today," she said. "To whatever account he gives you. Yes, today. I said today." She ended the call and faced Logan across 10 feet of oil-stained concrete. "The money will hit your account before the sun goes down," she said. "You earned it. I don't pretend otherwise." Her tone was even, but her eyes were doing something complicated, studying him now, the way she should have studied him 20 minutes earlier. Where did a man who delivers hydraulic fittings learn to do in 5 minutes what my best people couldn't do in 2 hours? Logan met her look without heat. "Air Force," he said. 12 years on the flight line, then a shop of my own that never quite pays for itself. He glanced at the engine still running clean, and there was no pride in his face, only the flat satisfaction of a man who had done a thing correctly. "Your people are smart. They just trusted their screens more than their ears. A machine like this one tells you what's wrong if you'll shut up long enough to hear it." That answer landed on Scarlett harder than the fix itself. She had spent a fortune assembling a team that trusted screens, and a man with 200,000 miles on his truck had just told her, without any cruelty at all, that all of it had been looking in the wrong direction. She was quiet for a moment, and then she made the second decision of the afternoon, the one that would matter even more than the first, though neither of them knew it yet. "I want you at Hayes Aerospace," she said. "Chief engineer, your own team, your own budget, real resources, real aircraft. Name a salary, and I'll beat it." She said it plainly as an offer between equals, though the equality was new and she was still trying it on. A man who can do what you just did shouldn't be delivering parts out of a truck. Come work where the work is worthy of you. Logan looked at her for a long moment, and the shop, the mortgage, and the invoices that never quite covered the months all moved through his mind at once. He thought about the household he carried alone, and about what a title and a budget and a real salary could mean for the future of the small family that depended on him. A man did not get many doors like this one, and pride was a poor thing to trade a future for. The $5 million would clear a great deal, and a permanent place at a company like this one could secure everything that came after. "I have obligations," he said, carefully because he did not want her to mistake his reasons. "People who count on me. If I take this, it's for them, not for the title." He looked at the $50 bills outline in his shirt pocket, then back at her. "I'll come, chief engineer. But I do the work my way, and I say what I see, even when you don't want to hear it. That's the whole deal, or there's no deal." "Agreed," Scarlett said, and she extended her hand, and Logan shook it, and the 12 engineers who had laughed at him watched their new chief engineer seal an arrangement that none of them had seen coming. Marcus Reed shook Logan's hand too when it was expected of him, and his grip was correct, and his smile was thin. and Logan filed that away the way he filed the sound of a valve about to stick. Across the hangar near the service door, a maintenance tech named Ray Delgado watched the whole thing with a slow grin, because Ray had flown with Logan in the Air Force a lifetime ago and had always known exactly what his old friend was worth. Scarlett flew to Denver that afternoon and closed her acquisition, and the $5 million hit Logan's account before sundown, exactly as she had promised. On paper, it looked like the cleanest possible victory for the mechanic, a fortune and a career handed to him in a single afternoon. But Scarlett Hayes had not offered him a job because she had come to respect him. She had offered it because he was useful, and because a woman who measured people by their numbers had simply discovered that his number was higher than she had thought. The distinction did not seem important yet. It would come to mean everything. Logan drove back to Amarillo that night with a signed offer on the seat beside him and the $50 bill still folded in his pocket, and he kept the bill on purpose, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of exactly how the woman he now worked for had seen him the first time she looked. He did not know yet that she had not stopped seeing him that way. He only knew that the money was real, the job was real, and the future he carried for the people who depended on him had just gotten a little less heavy. For one night, that was enough. The chief engineer title looked good on paper and meant less than nothing on the floor. Logan arrived at Hayes Aerospace on a Monday with his own tools in a scarred steel box, and by Wednesday, he understood that Scarlett had hired his hands without ever intending to hire his judgment. The office they gave him was real, the salary was real. The budget existed on a spreadsheet somewhere, but the respect that was supposed to come with all of it had been quietly withheld, and no one seemed to think he had noticed. Scarlett set the tone from the first week. She handed him the jobs no one else wanted, the failures other teams had already given up on, and she attached deadlines to them that were meant to break rather than test. A retrofit that should have taken a month arrived on his desk with a 9-day clock. A diagnostic backlog that 3 teams had abandoned became his alone to clear on top of everything else, with the clear implication that stumbling would prove something she already believed about him. He did not stumble. He cleared the retrofit in 8 days and the backlog in 6, and he did it without drama, working late in a building that emptied at 5 while the household waited on him at home. Each time he delivered, he expected the ledger to shift, expected the impossible task to earn him a little ground. Instead, Scarlett simply raised the bar, handed him something harder, and offered no acknowledgement at all, as though excellence were merely the rent he owed for being allowed through the door. It took Logan a few weeks to understand what he was actually looking at. He had assumed at first that she was demanding because the company demanded it, that the pressure was the price of a serious operation. But the pattern was too clean for that. She was not pushing him to see whether he would rise. She was pushing him to prove to herself and to everyone watching that a man who had come up from an oil-stained shop did not truly belong inside a company that bore her name. No matter how good his hands were, Marcus Reed made that reading easy to confirm. The flight center manager had not forgiven the hangar, and he ran a quiet campaign of small obstructions, parts, requisitions that vanished, meetings rescheduled without notice, technical reports that reached Scarlett's desk with Logan's name filed off. He was careful, and he was patient, and he never once did anything a person could point to directly, which was exactly how Logan knew he was dealing with a man who had done this before to someone else. The central injury, though, came from the work itself and from what happened to it after Logan had done it. Twice in that first stretch, a major technical crisis rolled through the flight center, the kind of failure that could ground a fleet and cost the company millions, and both times it was Logan who found the fault, and Logan who fixed it working past midnight while the responsible teams went home. Both times the solution reached the executive floor, scrubbed clean of him, presented by Marcus Reed and his managers as a triumph of their own careful process. Logan learned about the first theft secondhand from Ray Delgado, who had transferred onto his crew and who heard everything the floor whispered. "They're telling the 14th floor it was Reed's team that caught the fuel line fault," Ray said one evening, leaning in the doorway of Logan's office with 2 cups of the terrible break-room coffee. "The one you found at 1 in the morning while his people were home in bed. Word is, Scarlett sent a note down congratulating them." He set 1 cup on Logan's desk. "Thought you'd want to hear it from a friend." Logan took the coffee and said nothing for a moment, turning the information over the way he turned over a strange noise in an engine, listening for what it really meant. "She knows," he said. Finally. And it was not a question. Scarlett Hayes did not run a company this tightly and remain ignorant of who actually solved her hardest problems. If the credit was landing on Marcus Reed's desk, it was because she had decided to let it, or because it suited her to keep Logan hungry and unproven and grateful for a place he had not yet been allowed to truly own. He was right. Scarlett knew exactly whose hands had saved the fleet both times, and she chose her silence deliberately. In her mind, the pressure was a kindness of a kind, a forge. She had been underestimated her whole career, and it had made her formidable, and some part of her believed that withholding recognition would temper Logan, the same way would burn off whatever softness a small shop life had left in him and turn him into something harder and more useful. She told herself she was building him. She did not let herself examine the fact that she was also very simply refusing to admit she had been wrong about him in that hangar. For Logan, the middle of that season was where the ground shifted under his feet, though nothing visible marked the change. He had come to Hayes Aerospace believing his fight was to prove he was good enough to earn the title by being undeniable. Somewhere in those long nights watching his best work walk out the door under another man's name, while the woman who signed his checks said nothing, he realized that the exhaustion he felt had almost nothing to do with the volume of work. It had to do with the fact that he had never once in all those weeks been treated as though he were worth respecting. That was the quiet turn that changed what he wanted. He stopped trying to prove he was brilliant because he had proved it a dozen times, and it had bought him nothing. What he found he could not surrender was something smaller and far more stubborn, the plain sense of his own worth as a man, the thing that had kept his word good through years when it would have been easier to cut corners. He had traded a great deal in his life for the people who depended on him. He was not willing to trade that. Marcus Reed pushed him toward the edge without meaning to do him a favor. Deeper into that second stretch, Logan submitted a redesign for the Flight Center's engine testing protocol, a genuinely better method that would catch the exact class of fault the senior team kept missing, the starter valve family of failures that had humiliated them in the hangar. He wrote it up, cleanly ran the numbers, and sent it through the proper channels, and it came back rejected within 2 days with a single dismissive line about unproven procedures from outside sources. A few weeks later, the same protocol reappeared in a company-wide bulletin as a Hayes Aerospace innovation credited to Marcus Reed's department, celebrated in an internal memo as a leap forward in reliability. Ray Delgado read it aloud in Logan's office, with disgust thick in his voice. "They rejected your idea, waited a month, and then published it with his name on it," Ray said. "Same numbers, same method. They didn't even change the diagrams enough to hide it." He tossed the printout onto the desk. "How long are you going to keep feeding a place that eats you and thanks somebody else?" Logan looked at the bulletin, at his own work, wearing another man's signature, and felt the last of something settle into place inside him. The money was good, better than anything the shop had ever brought in. The $5 million sat safe in an account, and the salary was more than he had made in the best 3 years of his old life combined. And none of it he understood now was worth the slow erosion of the one thing he had always been able to carry with him. A man could be paid a great deal to disappear. He had simply not known that was the transaction until now. He did not decide in a rage, because rage was not how Logan made decisions. He decided the way he approached a seized valve, calmly having listened long enough to be sure of the fault. Over the next several days, he closed out every open job on his bench, documented every system he had been quietly holding together so that no aircraft would be endangered by his leaving, and made sure the work was clean enough that no one could later say he had walked away from a responsibility. Whatever he thought of Scarlet Hayes, he would not let a plane fall out of the sky to make a point. Then he took the $5 million wager money and set it aside in his mind, because that was his earned, honestly, in front of 40 witnesses, and it belonged to the people who counted on him. But the salary, the title, the position, all the parts of the arrangement that were supposed to come wrapped in respect, and had never once contained any those he found he could not keep. To go on drawing a chief engineer's pay from a company that treated him as a useful stranger would make him complicit in his own diminishment, and that was a price he was no longer willing to pay. On a Thursday evening, he walked up to the executive floor without an appointment, past the assistant who tried to stop him, and into Scarlett's office, where she sat behind a desk the size of a small boat, with the city going gold behind her. He set a single folded document in front of her. His resignation written plainly, effective immediately, with a full handover already completed, so that nothing would break when he was gone. He did not raise his voice, and he did not perform his anger, because the decision was already made, and performing it would only cheapen it. "I'm resigning," Logan said. "Everything's documented, every open job is closed or handed off clean. No aircraft is at risk, because I'm walking out that door." He kept his voice level the same torque wrench steadiness he had used in the hangar. "I'm keeping the $5 million. I earned that in front of your whole team fair and square. But the salary, the title, all of it I'm giving back. It never came with any respect in it, and I'd rather have that than your paycheck." Scarlett looked up at him, and the first thing she felt was not loss, but a kind of cold satisfaction, because she read the moment entirely wrong. To her, a man returning a title and a fortune's worth of salary over wounded feelings was a man ruled by pride, and pride was a weakness she had watched destroy better people than a mechanic from Amarillo. She had spent months quietly testing him, and here, she believed, was the test finally failed. The ego cracking under exactly the pressure that should have made him great. "If that's how you want to play it," she said, and her voice was flat and businesslike, and faintly amused the voice of a woman who thought she was watching someone throw away everything out of spite. "I accept your resignation, effective immediately, as you say." She did not stand. "No company is indispensable to one man, Mr. Brooks, and no man is indispensable to a company. You'll learn that out there. I built this place before you walked into that hangar, and it will run just fine after you walk out of it." Logan looked at her for a moment, and there was no anger left in his face, only something that might have been pity if it had been less tired. "Maybe," he said. "I hope so for the sake of everyone who flies your planes." He turned and walked out past the assistant, past the row of managers who had learned by now to watch which way the wind moved, and Marcus Reed among them, unable to keep a thin smile off his face as the threat to his territory removed itself. Scarlett sat alone in the gold light after he was gone, and felt for exactly the length of one long breath a flicker of something she could not name and did not want to. Then she pushed it down, the way she pushed down everything that did not fit her sense of how the world worked. She had made her fortune by trusting her read on people, and her read on this one was simple. He was talented and proud. The pride had finally outrun the talent, and now he was a mechanic again. And that was the natural order reasserting itself. She was so certain of it that she never questioned the certainty, which was precisely the flaw that had cost her before and would cost her again, because she had not in fact just watched a proud man self-destruct. She had watched a man who knew his own worth refuse to sell it any longer at a discount, and she had let him walk out the door believing she was the one who had won. The difference between those two readings was the difference between the woman she was tonight and the woman she would be forced to become, and it lived in a gap she could not yet see across. Logan drove home to Amarillo that night, with the resignation behind him and the wager money still safe, and for the first time in nearly 3 months, the tiredness in his shoulders was the honest kind, the kind that came from a decision made rather than a diminishment endured. He had walked away from more money than his father had earned in a lifetime, and he had done it for the people who depended on him just as much as he had taken the job for them. Because a man who let himself be hollowed out was no use to anyone who loved him, no matter how large the paycheck. The Brooks Aviation shop was exactly as he had left it, the oil-stained floor and the coffee maker that had outlived so much, and he unlocked it the next morning and got back to work. The $5 million would change things slowly and carefully, the way real money should, but the shop would go on, being the shop, and the work would go on, being honest, and no one would ever again publish his ideas under another man's name. He did not know that Scarlett Hayes would one day stand in this doorway needing him. He only knew that he could carry himself upright again, and after months of not quite managing it, that was worth every dollar he had left on her desk. The crisis came 4 months after Logan walked out, and it came at the worst possible hour. Scarlett had spent that spring chasing the largest contract in the company's history, a defense-adjacent partnership worth more than every deal she had closed in the previous 3 years combined, and the signing was set to happen aboard her own jet, a flight staged as a statement of power, with the partners watching from leather seats. The morning of that flight, on the ramp of the Hayes Aerospace Flight Center, the aircraft went dark in a way that no one on her payroll could explain. It was not the same fault as before, and that was what frightened the engineers most. This was a cascading failure that touched the fuel management, the ignition sequencing, and the control software all at once, a tangle of symptoms that pointed everywhere and therefore nowhere. Marcus Reed's team swarmed the aircraft with the same confidence they had shown in the hangar a lifetime ago, and within 2 hours, that confidence had drained away into the same helpless silence, the engines refusing to answer no matter what they tried. Scarlett brought in reinforcements the way only a billionaire can, flying specialists from the original manufacturer in on a chartered turboprop, hiring an outside consultancy that billed by the hour and guaranteed nothing. The manufacturer's experts arrived certain and left baffled. The consultants ran their diagnostics and produced a report full of maybes. By the second day, the partners had grown cold. The signing had been postponed once, and the postponement had begun to look like the kind of weakness that made men reconsider whether they wanted to be in business with Hayes Aerospace at all. It was in the middle of that second day, standing in a hangar full of the most expensive expertise money could summon, that Scarlett finally understood the shape of what she had done. She started pulling records, tracing the history of the systems that kept failing, and the same truth surfaced in file after file. The intricate technical fixes that had held her fleet together for years, the quiet saves that had kept aircraft in the air and crises out of the press, had almost all traced back to one man working late while everyone else went home. She had spent 4 months telling herself the company ran fine without him. The records told her she had been living on borrowed time. Marcus Reed had no answers left, only excuses, and when Scarlett looked at him now, she saw clearly what she had chosen not to see before a man skilled at claiming credit and helpless at earning it. The realization was almost physical. Every solution she had let land on his desk, every innovation she had watched him publish, had been stolen from the one engineer she had driven out the door for the crime of asking to be respected. She had rewarded the thief and forged the victim, and now the thief stood empty-handed in front of a jet that would not start and a contract that was slipping away by the hour. There was exactly one person alive who could fix the aircraft in time, and Scarlett knew his name, and she knew she had let it fall like a $50 bill at his feet. No amount of money on the open market would conjure his particular gift, because she had already learned in that first hangar that his skill was not for sale to the highest bidder, only earned by the person willing to listen. She sat alone in her office that night, with the city going gold behind her, exactly as it had the evening he resigned. And she understood that if she wanted Logan Brooks, she would have to go to him on his ground, with nothing in her hands but the truth. She drove herself to Amarillo the next morning. No assistant, no motorcade, 40 miles of flat highway, in a car that cost more than the shop she was driving toward. The Brooks Aviation Building sat at the edge of the county field, exactly as it always had, a metal box with an oil-stained floor. And she stood in the open bay door in a suit that had never looked so out of place, watching Logan work under the wing of a small plane, with his sleeves rolled up. He glanced over, recognized her, and went back to the fitting in his hands, without any visible surprise, as though he had known this day would arrive, and had simply been waiting for it to find its way to his door. "The jet's dead," Scarlett said, because there was no point in pretending she had come for any other reason. Cascading failure fuel and ignition and control software all at once. The manufacturer's people can't find it. The consultants can't find it. My own team can't find it. She stood very straight, holding on to the last of her composure. "I have a contract worth more than everything I've ever closed, and it dies tomorrow if that aircraft doesn't fly. You're the only person I know who can save it." Logan set down the fitting and wiped his hands on the rag at his belt, and he looked at her for a long moment without any triumph in his face, which somehow made the moment harder for her to bear than gloating would have. "You drove all the way out here yourself," he said. "No assistant. That's new." He was not being cruel, only accurate, and the accuracy landed exactly where it needed to. 4 months ago, you told me no company was indispensable to one man. I'm guessing you've had some time to think about that." "I was wrong," Scarlett said, and the words came out steadier than she expected, because she had rehearsed them on 40 miles of highway and meant everyone. "About the company, about you, about all of it. I built my whole life on reading a person by the number attached to their name, and I read you as a $50 man in a hangar full of witnesses, and I have never been more wrong about anything." She met his eyes across the oil-stained floor. "I'm not going to insult you by leading with money. I came to ask for help, and I came to say I understand now what I did." Logan studied her, the way he studied a strange noise, listening past the words for whether they were true, and what he heard convinced him. He had walked away from Hayes Aerospace, not to punish her, but to keep something of his own intact, and punishing her now with a contract and a company and a great many innocent jobs hanging in the balance would make him into a smaller man than the one who had left that resignation on her desk. Whatever she had done to him, there was an aircraft that needed fixing and people whose livelihoods rode on it, and that was a simpler equation than pride. "I'll fix your plane," he said. "Not for the contract, and not because you drove out here and said the right words, though the words matter more than you think." He was already reaching for his jacket and his toolbox, the scarred steel one he had carried out of her building 4 months ago. "I'll fix it because there's an aircraft that won't start, and I know how to make it start, and that's reason enough. It always was. That's the part you never understood about me." They drove back to the flight center in separate vehicles, and Logan walked into the hangar full of manufacturers' experts and $100 an hour consultants, the same way he had walked in the first time an ordinary man in a work shirt, whom none of them thought to take seriously. He did not announce himself. He set his palm against the cowling, listened to the failed start sequence twice, and then went to work in front of all of them, tracing the cascade back through the tangle of symptoms to the single upstream fault that was throwing every downstream system into confusion. It took him the better part of an hour longer than the hangar fix, because the failure was genuinely complex, but he never once looked lost, and the room went quiet around him, the way rooms did when someone competent was finally doing the thing everyone else had failed to do. Scarlett watched from a few feet away, and what struck her was not the skill which she had expected, but the complete absence of performance. He was not proving anything to anyone. He asked for no audience and sought no credit, and did not once glance her way to see whether she was impressed. He worked because the work needed doing, and that plain fact undid something in her that 4 months of consequences had only loosened. When he closed the last panel and told the flight engineer to run the sequence, both engines caught and settled into that same, clean, synchronized roar she had heard in a different hangar on a different day, and the sound meant something entirely different to her now. The manufacturer's experts stared. The consultant stopped typing. Marcus Reed stood at the edge of the crowd and understood finally and publicly that the Emperor had never had any clothes, that every triumph he had claimed had belonged to the man he was watching wipe grease off his hands. Scarlett walked out to Logan while the engine still ran and did the thing she had never done for anyone in her adult life, which was apologize without a single qualification attached. "I used money and power to decide what you were worth, and I was wrong, and it cost me you," she said loud enough that the hangar could hear, because the injury had been public, and the apology deserved to be too. "You saved this company more times than I let anyone admit, and I forged the man who stole your work and drove out the man who did it. I'm sorry. Not for the contract. For all of it." The hangar heard every word, and Marcus Reed heard it most of all, and there was no speech required to finish him, because the truth had already done the work. Within the week, he was gone from Hayes Aerospace quietly, the way men like him always went once the thing they had been standing on was removed. Ray Delgado, who had stayed on and watched the whole slow collapse from the floor, told Logan later that half the flight center had breathed easier the day Reed cleared out his office. But that all came afterward. In the moment, there was only Scarlett standing in front of Logan, with her pride set down at last, and Logan looking at her with the running engines behind him. "I want you back," she said. "Not as chief engineer, not as an employee I hand impossible jobs to and forget to thank. As a partner. Equal standing, equal say your name on the work you do." It was the largest offer she had ever made to anyone, and she made it plainly the way he had taught her, without ever meaning to teach her anything. "Come build something with me instead of for me. I'll spend as long as it takes proving I've changed." Logan looked at her for a long moment, and he thought about the shop behind him in Amarillo, and the household that depended on him, and the months he had spent unable to carry himself the way he wanted to. "I'm not coming back to work for you," he said. And then, before the disappointment could finish crossing her face, he went on. "But I'll work with you. My shop stays mine. Hayes Aerospace and Brooks Aviation partner as equals real contract. Real terms, and I keep the right to say what I see even when you don't want to hear it. Same deal I offered you in that hangar. That part never changed. That's the only deal I want," Scarlett said, and this time when she put out her hand, it was not a bet being sealed or a talent being purchased, but two people meeting on level ground, and Logan shook it, and the arrangement that neither of them could have imagined a year earlier became real in the wash of two engines running clean. The partnership that followed reshaped both of their lives, though not in the way the tabloids expected of a billionaire and a mechanic. Hayes Aerospace signed the contract the next day, the partners impressed less by the recovered aircraft than by the story that traveled with it of a CEO who had driven 40 miles alone to admit she had been wrong. The long-term agreement between the two companies followed within the month. Brooks Aviation's small shop suddenly tied to one of the most respected names in the industry, on terms Logan had written to protect exactly the independence he had nearly sold once and would never sell again. Scarlett changed the thing she could actually change, which was the culture of the company that bore her name. She dismantled the machinery that had let a Marcus Reed thrive, built a system where credit followed the work instead of the title, and made herself sit through the discomfort of listening before she demanded. It did not happen overnight, and it did not happen perfectly, but the woman who had once read people by their numbers spent the following year learning to read them by what they could do and who they were, and the company grew healthier for it, in ways that eventually showed up even on the balance sheets she had always trusted more than her own eyes. Logan kept his shop and kept the lights off when he could out of habit now more than need, and became something he had never expected to be a partner, the whole industry treated with the respect he had once done, a dozen impossible jobs to earn and been denied. The $5 million had cleared a great deal for the people who depended on him, and the partnership secured the rest, and the future he had carried alone for so long stopped feeling like a weight balanced on the edge of a bad quarter. He had walked away from a fortune's worth of salary to keep his self-respect, and in the end, that self-respect had turned out to be the thing that bought him everything else. What grew between him and Scarlett over that year was not the thing the gossip columns kept hoping for, but something the two of them found they valued more, a genuine friendship built on gratitude and hard-earned trust, rather than on the gap between what she owned and what he did not. She had learned to see him, and he had learned that she was capable of change. And out of those two difficult lessons came a partnership of equals who had each survived the other's worst assumptions and come out the far side with something real. The $50 bill still sat folded in a drawer in the shop, and Logan kept it not as a wound anymore, but as a marker of how far a person could travel from a single wrong judgment if they were willing to admit it. Money had been able to buy Scarlett Hayes' time, and it had been able to buy her talent right up until the day it could not buy her the one thing she needed. A person's worth was not the number attached to their name, and respect could not be commanded, only earned. And once she understood that she finally deserved the loyalty and the trust she had spent her whole life trying to purchase. Logan had known it all along, standing in that first hangar with a $50 bill at his feet, choosing to pick it up and do the work anyway. He had never needed her to see his worth in order to know it himself. That was the strength she had mistaken for pride, and the thing she had chased across 40 miles of highway, and the quiet center of a man who had refused to be bought, and had, in refusing, won the only kind of victory that lasts.